That's okay. So the first thing I want to do now, with using Minsky in anger, so to speak, is to compare loanable funds to endogenous money. And the intriguing thing is it's normally pretty hard to do that because it's hard to find anything that expresses loanable funds as a model of banking, because they're using loanable funds, they ignore banks. But there is what's called a bank in the appendix to the Eggertson and Krugman's paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. It's called the debt deflation, a Minsky-Kuh-Fisher approach, I think they call it. And here is what they think is a bank. Can you read the text? It's small. So we assume one household type can invest in capital, while the other can only invest in a one-period risk-free bond. In order to have borrowing and lending in the steady state, we need to ensure the borrowers cannot self-finance. So a common way is giving them a finite horizon. A mathematical equivalent way is to assume the borrower is more impatient, or a shortcut we use in this paper. And banks accept deposits from some anonymous depositor and lends to individual I. Deposits are paid out the next period and the loan collected. We consider a bank, thank God they've got it in inverted commas, as a life of a single loan contract. And there's a bank contract, and on it goes. You know, all I could think of when I read this stuff was think, what planet are these guys on? And it reminded me of, any Star Trek fans here? You know Star Trek? Who doesn't know Star Trek? Some don't know Star Trek. Well, there's a little parody of Star Trek, because there's a line from Spock, not quite as simple as, it's not life, it's life, Jim, but not life as we know or understand it. And there's a parody song done of it, which I absolutely love. There's many versions of it.
It's life, Jim, but not as we know it, not as we know it. It's life.
I think it's a bank, Jim, but not as we know it. You know, it's a crazy, crazy notion of a bank. So what I want to do instead is model the intermediaries' vision they've got of what banking is all about. And they see banks just as intermediaries who arrange loans between one non-bank and another non-bank. Okay, there's no role for the bank at all. So, and here's Krugman stating it when he's having a go at me in that Minsky methodology entry back in 2012. And he states it very, very clearly, which is one thing I like about his writing style. I'll mention an aside over a drink about that, but I won't mention it on anything I'm going to record. He said, if I decide to cut back on my spending and stash the funds in a bank, which lends them out to someone else, okay, that's the vision. Okay? So I save a bit more, put them in a bank lends them out. Okay? He said that doesn't have to present a net increase in demand, so that's on he goes from that point. So I'm going to put that, rather than the off with the fairies vision of what banks are like, of this law and that particular argument beforehand, I'm going to build a bank, and it's going to have a patient consumer sector leaning to an impatient investor sector, and that's what they largely have. When their DSG model has one agent producing a consumer good and the other producing an investment good, so that's more realistic, similar to what they're saying. So the consumer sector lends to the investment sector, the investment sector pays interest to the consumer sector on the loan, and the bank collects a fee from the consumer sector because it arranged the loan, it's intermediation. That's the only source of profits for the banks in this vision of how banks operate. So let's get through and go at it. So what I need reserves, because that's where deposits are going to be stored, at the asset and the liability effect. You put the money in the bank, they've got the cash in the vault, you then have the deposit account. C underscore D. The underscore in Minsky creates a subscript. So that's just a little way of making it easier to read. C underscore D, that's the deposit account for the patient consumer goods sector. I underscore D is the account for the impatient investor sector. W underscore D is deposit account for workers. Again, you could have multiple accounts there, but I'm just putting one account in for simplicity. B underscore E is the bank equity account. So the bank has assets, liability, and equity, and I've got it behaving as a non-seniorage operating bank. It only buys and sells and earns income out of its equity account. Of course, they could do other things in real practice. So what I build is that little system there. So I'll bring that up in Minsky. I've already done this, but I'll take the gamble of seeing if I can do it again live. So you bring an icon down, double click on it, choose an asset class here, make this reserves. Click on the plus button to create a new column. You now got liabilities, so I'm going to call this C underscore D. Notice each when I click on the plus key, you see the C underscore D is now turned up down here, properly shown. Then I'm going to have I underscore D. and then W underscore D. So those are the three liabilities, and now make a bit more space here, choose equity, and make this B underscore E for bank equity. So I've now got the 5 accounts created there. Sometimes it takes, if I trigger another plus key, I'd get the other one coming down here. What I'll do is now go to the initial conditions. So the initial conditions I set up in this were 100 in reserves, 80, 10, 8 and 2. So let's go and do that. Pardon me flashing around here. So 100 in reserves. When I type that, notice Minsky is going to give me a sum for the row now of 100, pointing out that I've got to make the others balance to the same amount. This is another advantage again, because the initial conditions have to interact with each other. You can't do this automatically in the flowchart thing. You forget what your initial conditions are for one account and another. Just make sure you keep track of it. So I've got minus 80 there. I think it was minus 10. Now it's down. The row sum is now 10 minus 8, and then minus 2, and I've now got the row sum summing to 0. So I've got that operation done. Now I'm going to have consumer sector lending to the investment sector. So I'm going to type lend, L-E-N-D, as the flow from the consumer sector to the investment sector. So I come down here and I click on the plus button here to create a new row and call this lending. Oops. This is just a label. We're not making use of that in any practical way as yet. So if I type the word lend here, notice the program will now, when I move away, give me lend as a total. I've got to type minus lend here, and now that row sum is balanced. And if you go back and look at Minsky, I've now got lend as an operation coming in on the left hand side there. So then investment pays interest and repays the consumer sector, so let's whack those in there. So I now click on, I'll bring up Minsky's window in the background here, you can see it more clear. So I have repay, that's just a label, but I put it over here, it's plus repay here. You don't need to type the plus key, by the way, just type the word without anything before it. You need to type a minus probably to get the negative sign, minus repay. And then one more row here and call this interest. I can put any label I like there. Now the interest payment is going to go from the investment sector to the consumer sector, and then you're going to pay a fee. This is the intermediation fee. I'll just call that fee from the consumer sector across to the banking sector's equity account. Well, let's see what happens next. And then I have hiring workers and buying from each other and buying from the consumer sector. So I put it all together. That's the overall pattern. So let's just do that. So I've got the bank fee. Then I have, I'll just put hire just to save time here. So that's going to be a flow of wages from the consumption sector to the workers. So wages underscore C, and over here minus wages underscore. Now if I type, for example, a lowercase letter, and the program, the sum doesn't come 0 over here. So the program's warning you've made a mistake. If that's the case, click in that area, hold down the control key and move sideways, and then you can delete. Okay, if for example if I had for example a lowercase w there, for example, made a mistake like that, then if I just press the arrow key I go between cells, but I hold the control key down, I move inside a cell, and now I can get to that point, press the delete key, type capital W, and the program now tells me I've got that particular bit right. So again, hire workers, this is now the investment sector doing it, so this is going to be wages underscore I, going over here to minus wages underscore I. Then I've got the consumer, I've got the investment sector buying consumer inputs, so I've got intersectoral relationships going on here. So I'll just put Connie in just to save time. That's going to go from the consumer sector. Let's just move the table down so we can see the two more clearly as I do it. That's the image I've taken beforehand. So I now have I underscore C, activities by the investment sector buying from the consumer sector, so that turns up over here. And then say investment inputs as well. That's going to be the consumer sector I underscore C. I'd actually recommend using more meaningful labels, but it's just to save space when I'm doing it on screen, because sometimes you can forget what they stand for. I did for a while. I made a little error until I worked out what I'd done wrong. So workers consume here, so that's going to be CONS underscore W from the workers going across to the firm's account, and then bankers doing the same thing. And I'll just save time and label this. So CONS underscore B is minus CONS underscore B. By the way, if you want to be more complicated and have a longer subscript, there's a little trick we're using from a language called LaTeX. We're using a mathematics language processing system to do our formatting. I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. So having done all that, you can now see this very large bank icon has turned up here. I'll just save this. So that's created the basic structure that neoclassical economists think describes banking. If you look at the equations, let's see if the equation tab has worked here. Yep, okay. So what I've got is all the equations have been defined down here. These are all the flow equations. So the flow of money into the bank equity account is the fee in minus consumption out. The flow in the consumer deposit account is repayment back in, which is an inflow, interest and inflow, consumption by workers and bankers, which are inflow, outflows of lending, paying the fee, wages. No, I think I've got something. Oh no, yeah. Plus CI plus IC. Maybe I've got the signs wrong in that.
There's one column where you've got the INC wrong way.
Thank you. That's one of the beauties of being able to see it. You're right. I didn't even notice that. Yeah, I didn't do that. That's an unintentional mistake, which you can see.
I wanted to see what happened.
Yeah. Well, that's. Thank you. Okay, so I've now got to have this one has to be minus over here. Again, that would have taken ages to debug in a flowchart program. And have I got it right? Or put it in the wrong place? Yeah. So I've got investment by consumption. Aha. Right, and now, having done that, logic's right. Okay, so that's the beauty of the double entry bookkeeping approach. You know now, having done all that, when I come back over to the program here. Okay, and now I've got IC turning up as a inflow. I've got an inflow, and have I made a mistake? I've got IC 4 times, haven't I? Yeah. That's why I said you should use more meaningful terms for it. So I've shown my own point unintentionally. Okay, so I'm going to, what I'll have here, I'll make this cons, and here I'll use the lower case here. This is the advantage of Minsky is the only program, by the way, that supports using subscripts and Greek characters in system dynamics. Quite bizarre. All the others don't. So I think it makes it easier to read all this stuff. So what have I got? Consumer inputs. Hang on a sec. Let's make it more obvious. This is going to be a very lengthy label, but it'll make more sense. Just to lead away.
Copy and paste in that program.
Not yet. There's copy and paste of elements, but it's only 2,500 hours of programming for the whole system yet, so it's got a long way to go before. That's why I want more funding to add, obviously important features like that. Let's say C and then underscore, make this inputs to I, which is what I want to say, that the investment sector buying and consumption inputs into producing its own output. So, okay, this is now to be minus C underscore and then curly brackets inputs to I, close curly bracket. Okay, I've got that one right. I'll leave it at that one because this is why I shouldn't do this sort of stuff live. You can make mistakes. You're too busy talking and trying to do it at the same time. So now look at this, you now get the correct logic there. So it is worth going between the two. Now imagine trying to write those equations by hand, which I used to do before I discovered that I could use a table to generate it. First of all did that in MathCAD and then finally got the funding to develop the software for Minsky. But it means you can build quite an elaborate system. So I'll just save this one again. What I'm going to do now, not to take too much time, is just go through some movies I've recorded working further on this whole system. So I've got the IC and CI indicated there, and what it then generates is the set of those differential equations I've shown you a moment ago. So that's the power of the system, that it makes it possible to build these very elaborate models but not make mistakes in terms of what's happening between different stocks with flows between them. So these are just placeholders right now, and you've got to define them, and the method is exactly the same as for the flowchart system I've shown you beforehand, but you've just got to grab one of the icons and take it off the system. So I'll just show you that for one. Let's move the bank over here a bit. Let's say I wanted to find interest payments. Then I'd right click here and choose copy and drag it over here, and now I'm going to say multiply that. That interest is going to be interest on the debt multiplied by the rate of interest on loans. So I type R underscore curly bracket loans, for example, close curly bracket, press the enter key, and I've got rate of underscore loans multiplied by, but where's debt? Okay. Debt's not there yet, is it? The reason being, let's just show you the little movie again. Debt's not there because debt's neither an asset nor a liability of the banking sector and loanable funds. It's an asset of the consumer sector and the liability of the investment sector. So I've got to bring those in now and show them as well. So I've got to add additional tables. Let's go and do that over here. You can add as many godly tables as you like. Oh, by the way, I might as well change the name. If I double click or right click, I can choose open godly table. It just randomly allocates a number right now, so I'm going to call this bank. And back over here. But now bring another icon down, double click on it. I'll now name this one consumer sector. Again, we're not doing anything with that label as yet. Now, if I choose asset here, I'm saying whatever I want to see now on this column is going to be an asset of the entity I'm defining at the moment. Assets will be, of this entity, going to be liabilities of other entities. If I click here, I get a choice of three. CD, which is the consumer sector's deposit account, ID, and WD. Now, if I choose CD, watch what the program does. It instantly populates the table with all the operations that are currently shown for that column. And note you can see the row sums are all wrong, which means you've got to add additional columns in there. So let's add one more column and say I'm going to define D for debt. I'll call it debt just to make it more obvious than this simulation. That's debt, which is an asset of the consumer sector. So we now know that lending is going to increase that asset. So I now type LEND as a positive. Repayment's going to reduce it, minus repay. Okay. But those are the only operations I can define so far, because let's give the debt, say, an initial value of, say, 20. So the consumer sector's total assets are not, pardon me, that's got minus 20, that it should be 20, my mistake, because it's positive, it's an asset. So the consumer sector's got a total net worth of 100 now. I've now got to add other elements in here. Now I don't have any liabilities for the consumer sector, but I do have equity for it. So if I now type, say, NW underscore C for consumer sector, I can say, well, its net assets are 100, so I balance that row. And now I've got to type in the negatives and the positives to balance all the rest out. So the fee is a payment out of the system. It's purchasing of investment goods from the investment sector is an outflow. It's getting interest in. It's paying wages out. This is the investment sector purchasing inputs from it. Effectively arguing there's like light industry and heavy industry, so you have to buy those inputs. And I've got the wrong sign. Notice my mistake there. It's an inflow. So I've now got to type the minus. And then consumption by bankers is an inflow, so negative, and consumption by workers is an inflow, so a negative. And I've now got that totally balanced. Okay. Now you see how the system's grown rather a lot. Let's move these bits out of the way here. I'll define that later. Save it as it is. Let's bring another bank icon in. Call this the investment sector. Asset classes, what's available? Well, there's ID. And now you see all the operations. If I now have got the operations shown for that column, but if I now say what are the liabilities, of course, the debt is a liability of the investment sector. And when I click on debt, the program then instantly matches these two operations, lending and repayment. And I've now got the remaining element to add the equity of the investment sector. So I call this NW_I for investment sector's net worth. Okay, so that's going to be a positive because it's paying money out to buy inputs. This is an inflow of the investment, the consumer sector purchasing from it. And I've got a mistake there. What have I done? I've got an I-C. So I've got to make that underscore. I didn't hold the key down properly. Interest payments out. And wages out. And then the net worth, as you can see, is actually going to be minus 10, which I show as a positive here. Equities, for the accounting convention, you show equity as a negative. So put a positive sum there. The firm sector's got a negative net worth. Now that might sound strange, but in fact if you read Schumpeter, one argument he makes that firms are the classic debtors in the capitalist economy. They've borrowed the money, they're spending that money, so they've got a debt which there's constant, which is paid, which when they borrow the money and spend it, they're buying inputs, so the money falls. They're going to have a net negative equity, but they've got a cash flow being generated by the debt they're in. So, intriguing little, again, these are some things I've learned just by putting the software together. So that's the investment sector. I could do the workers as well, and I have in the version I've got on the simulation, on the PowerPoint, so I'll leave it with that. So there's the consumer sector. I've done all those operations now. I've added D for debt, given an initial value of 20, matching entries, and what you finally get is that table as I've shown you, and two more godly tables, the investment sector and workers. Do the same sort of stuff with the drop down menu. Now this is just showing you the movie of doing this. That's how this works. Let's see. Okay, so just repeating the same thing. Create the asset class, choose a drop down, add another column, make that a liability, add another column for equity, click in the drop down here, there's debt, operations come across, create this as a statement of the net worth of the investment sector, type in your matching entries, fix up the net net worth, and you've got the system defined overall. Now you can also resize the elements. I'll show you the godly tables are huge, as you can see here. This is a recently added feature. So you just right click and choose resize. You then get a bounding box, and you can make them a bit smaller. You can make them tiny, which is painful to do if you do it by mistake, but that makes it easier to put the stuff on screen and make more space for adding in other elements to the model later. So like for example, what I've done here is define the banking sector, but I haven't yet defined interest, but now I can do that. So let's do that. So I've got the rate of interest on loans. Now I come over here and I right click on the debt there, choose copy, drag that over here, and then wire this up. Again, it's sometimes hard to reach that little circle to grow it. Save it, and now if you look over here in the equations, I've now defined interest is equal to the rate of interest on loans times debt. Okay? So you're building quite an elaborate model of the economy. Still simple, very, very simple levels to begin with, but the logic is controlled for you for the interaction between different accounts, and that's the great advantage of Minsky over any of the other system dynamics programs. So what I've done there is I've copied all the various elements. Well, those are all the stocks, and these are all the flows. And what I'm now doing is defining the model by linking the two together, by defining the flows in terms of stocks. And of course, I haven't got any physical factors in here. I haven't got workers in actual numerical numbers. I haven't got the wage rate, which is not amount of money, it's amount of money per week, per time unit. I haven't got that inside there. That's making more elaborate to include the physical economy as well. But to showing that rate of interest, to finding the rate of interest, I've done that. I might as well just repeat it again. So, same basic idea. And again, using the fact you can type directly onto the keyboard, often the canvas with Minsky, which again you can't do in any. You can't do any other programs. Which again, it's one of those things. We're innovating ahead of the competition there. That's to find the rate of interest. One thing I haven't shown you, I'll show you now, is we have several types of constants inside here. There are bugs in this. Sometimes it won't work on you properly, but let's get this into value, say 0.05 for rate of interest. So I'll define that. Now it might be nice to make it something that can vary. So you choose slider, you get a slider up here. The program then automatically chooses the range for you. I'll make it say a range between a maximum of say 25% and a minimum of 1% with steps of 1%. And then during a simulation I can either click in that little shaft there, as you can see at the side, or when that bounding box is around the object, the arrow keys work. And control arrow key can move by a larger step in some cases as well, but that's moving by a step of 2. This is moving just by moving 1. So you can vary stuff live when you're running a simulation. Now, one thing I'll try doing this sometimes doesn't work is anything which can be defined as by something else as a flow. Okay? And just notice that I'll just come down here and zoom in. And then redraw. Notice that there's a little wedge there. We have to improve the appearance of that. It means you can actually put something on the other side. So I could, for example, I can run from debt to here, which is crazy, but I could, well, actually I've done it. Let's get rid of that. But of course, there are some things which are control parameters. That's what I want to make this into. If I make it a parameter, I hope this works. Yep. Notice its color changes and there's no longer an input, so you can't attach something to it. So that's like an exogenous variable in that sense. And you can then, as I said, vary those during a simulation, which I'll use that and show you loanable funds later on in the lecture. So the way that I'm relating all these stocks to flows is using what's called a time constant. I've explained that a bit. There's more technical detail to it, which I'll cover in that final lecture on mathematics. But it's a way of relating a stock to a flow. So if you think about money in an account, money in the consumer deposit account, that's, say, $10,000. It's an amount of money. That's dimensioned entirely just by dollars. So it's 10,000 of what? $10,000. To get a flow, what you're talking, say, for a consumer sector, it's going to be producing, say, $50,000 worth of goods per annum. Now that's the flow of dollars per year. So when you divide the stock by a flow, what you've got is what Marx used to talk about, which is the idea of a turnover rate. A rate of transition from money in to money out. How long does it take you to go from one to the other? That's your time constant. So if you say, Marx actually used the example at one stage of saying £1,000 in an account could turn over 12 times a year. So you get a time constant of 1/12 of a year or 1 month, okay, which would be a very productive capitalist enterprise. Okay. I use use a quarter of a year or 3 months. So if my time constant is 1/4, I divide the stock of money by 1/4 of a year. I'm then saying the flow of output is going to be 4 times that. Because dividing by 1/4 is multiplying by 4. Okay? So that's the idea of using a time constant and dividing rather than multiplying. It might seem strange when you first see it, but it makes much more sense because you're actually giving a value to that entity, which makes sense in terms of how fast the system operates. So if you say that the time constant going from m to m plus is 1/4 of a year, your time constant is 1/4, okay, and that then the money turns over 4 times in 1 year. If you were going the other way, you use a number like 4 for it, people would say, why have you got 4 there? Yeah? So the time constants make more sense, even though they're harder to get your head around initially. I think they make much more sense. So little movie of doing that for wages. Let's imagine there's a consumer sector, just going straight from M to M plus, and just looking, going from, actually I'm doing the whole thing here. We're going from the consumer sector, time lag in going from M to M plus, which means how long does it take to go from inputs to outputs. Wire this up, type the word output inside here. That's now giving me output. Now then argue that there's a share of the surplus between workers and capitalists. So I've got W underscore S as a worker's share. Make that say 0.7. So workers get 70%, capitalists get 30% in terms of the monetary value of output. Multiply those two together. And sometimes it's a real pain trying to reach that bloody little circle. Took me quite a while for that one. Same for WS, I think. Let's see. Kept on trying to reach the circle and they kept on moving it. It's just one of those things we have to fine tune. Finally I get it right. Okay. And then that gives wages. And then if I subtract wages from output, I've got profit. Of course, I need to be more elaborate if I want to include, like this is only gross profit, not net profit, of course. But wages minus output, I can call that profit for the consumer sector. So I wire that up. Okay. So that's the basic way of building a logic that way. What I finally get is that expression. Now, notice I had output rather than output for the consumer sector. Okay, so I made output underscore C over there, etc., etc. So what you ultimately get is that. And I know it looks complicated, but let's take a look at what happens. And one trick I'm using here, which I have to move the screen to show it to you. For a start, I'm defining money as the sum of the amount of money in the deposit accounts plus bankers' equity. Now that's in the sense that you get the argument from Graziani that money is the promises to pay the third agent, that third agent being the bank. Over here I've got a growth rate, and what I'm doing is saying if you take output and the rate of change of output and divide that by output itself, that's the percentage rate of, or the rate of growth as a fraction, multiplied by 100, I get a percentage rate of growth. What I forgot to do when I first set this up is to put some bounds on that. So I'm going to enter a constant there of say 10, meaning a 10% rate of growth. And this is one thing I haven't shown you yet. There's the 10. Notice that on the graphs there are these angled inputs. The angled inputs set the maximum and minimum bounds for an axis. So if I now drag it across here, the maximum value of that axis is going to be 10. And if I do the same with the minus 10, I could actually put it through a minus block, but it's just save space just to make it minus 10 here. On the other red angled input there. So that's going to be a graph between plus 10 and minus 10. And now if I simulate this model, this is loanable funds. And notice the fantastic rate of economic growth this economy achieves of 0. Okay? Because there's no change in the amount of money. I've got nothing changing in terms of velocity of money either at the moment. But it stabilises with a debt ratio of about 30% of GDP. Let's see if that's the case. Down here, debt ratio. Whoops. Yeah, 9.28. Growth is 0. Output goes on forever. We've done 300 years worth of simulation here. Nothing's happened because there's been no creation of money and there's been no change in velocity of circulation of money. So that's loanable funds. Okay.
But why is the growth rate 0? Have we defined it that way?
No, because I haven't got any change in productivity. It's just talking in money. It's monetary output. If I could actually have this attached to a model of physical production, and you might actually have technology improving and growth going on that way if you wanted to. Which is actually,
but it wouldn't change anything in the money.
Wouldn't change the money supply elements. Actually, that's a nice little. That'd be a nice little master's thesis type program to actually add that if anybody wants to give that a try. But that's loanable funds. Of course, that's not the real world. Okay. But there's your rate of growth being 0, but nothing's happening with the money supply. Nothing's changing anything. So I'm going to modify that to being endogenous money. and it's painfully simple to do. This is one of the beauties of I can actually do it in about 20 seconds. So all I'm saying, it's not the non-banks lending to other non-banks, it's the banking sector lending to a non-bank. So what I have to do, and once I do it, I get this, hang on, I get this result. I'll just show it to you. Actually, I'll do it live because I've got it sitting here. So you see, that's the overall outcome. Let's just go back to being able to see everything here, because what this is showing is treating the debt as an asset of the consumer sector. Now, it's not. I mean, yes, there's some non-bank lending in the system, but let's just go to a pure banking system. So notice these plus and minus keys here. Oh, by these these are supposed to be up and down arrows. There's a bug in the latest version that stuffed that up. What they let you do is move things around. So notice I've got bank intermediation fee, stuck in the middle of buying consumer inputs, then paying interest, lending, and repayment of debt. If I wanted to whack all the elements together of the financial element, then I'd click that one down there and I'd move bank intermediation down. So I've now got bank intermediation, paying interest, lending, and repaying debt, all there. But first of all, I'm going to use the delete key to get rid of debt being shown as an asset of the consumer sector. Notice the program's now telling me these two are unbalanced. Well, it's going to get rid of all those operations. So pay interest goes, lending goes, repayment of debt goes, and the bank intermediation fee goes. And I've now got to change the net worth because the net worth is not including the loan. It's now just 50. So that's set the consumer sector up properly. Of course, what I now want to show is the debt is actually an asset of the banking sector. So come over here and click on add an additional asset. And now the drop down is going to show what assets haven't been allocated. Well, D is there for debt. Lending and repayment now come across because they're operations that are still shown in the investor sector's view of the economy. But I now need to put in let's get rid of the bank intermediation fee. That's just a fiction of the loanable funds vision. I now simply have to have the interest payments being made to the bank, and the net worth of the bank now rises to 22 because it's got the loan as well. So that's now correct. Let's just check the consumer sector, that's correct. I haven't changed anything about the workers, they'll still be the same, and the investment sector will still be the same. So all the accounting is correct there. What I've got is I've got the amount of lending depending upon the balance of the account of the consumer sector, which is the loanable funds fantasy. So what I'm going to do is just delete CD from there, take a copy of D for debt, and say that level lending is related to the current amount of outstanding debt, which is a simple way of doing it. You can have much more elaborate visions, of course, when you set the whole thing up. So click on that back to 0. Let's make it a bit smaller so we can see the whole thing on screen at once. And reset back to 0 as I've done, just make sure. Hit run. And I think you can see over here output is rising. And now the growth rate's turning up over here. There's 0, it's well above 0. I'll just actually... Yeah. Yeah. So what you've got is a growing economy. Whoops, hang on. Try it down again. Okay, keep running. So that's the role of the change in debt in driving monetary growth in the economy. And you're getting a different debt ratio, as you can see, coming out of all that too. But just by simply taking the realistic argument that banks lend money and create money by doing it, and that money creation creates additional demand. And that's the point that I'm going to have to cover in the second lecture today. But this is not my best moment with Minsky, but I think trying to explain this with any other software flowchart or just with logic, verbal logic, would take forever. That's the difference between endogenous money and loanable funds. I think I need to say that I've already got a copy of that elsewhere. So that's just at the symbolic level, just at the mathematical. I've got a mathematical simulation there. and the change in debt is changing incomes and demand. So goodbye the loanable funds objection, the vision of including banking and including debt in macroeconomics. But what I haven't yet handled is what about the post-Keynesian objection that says that expenditure is identical to income. So therefore, how does change in debt turn up there? Now I'm going to finish 5 minutes early, leave that question and answer it in the second half of the lecture today at 3 o'clock. Who can't make the 3 o'clock lecture, by the way?